Morning, guys. Uh, I'm Venkat, and I'm here to present a talk on IoT from an attacker's perspective. I'm a security researcher at one of the largest chip making companies. So I've I flew in all the way from India just for this conference. So I hope I don't screw this up and deliver something of quality. So my areas of expertise include web, mobile, infra, code reviews, and the regular stuff. So the past few years I have been performing researches on Linux kernels and IoT related stuff, ranging from the devices, platforms to the applications. So yeah. The agenda or the takeaways that we can expect from today's talk is that we'll be able to understand what IoT exactly is and what are the components that are required to build an IoT solution, and understand what kind of attack surface it reveals to an attacker. And yeah, basically that's what we'll be looking at today. In the interest of time, I'll try to keep this as short as possible, but in case you find me going too fast, please feel free to interrupt. So this is the IoT foothold at this point of time. We can understand from this kind of a diagram that IoT has reached various verticals ranging from home automation, healthcare, transportation, retail, and so on and so forth. So we are pretty familiar with all these smart devices that we have in our homes. So we have dumb devices like coffee makers, even our televisions becoming smarter and smarter. So they call it smart device, but I call it an entry point for an attacker, because all it does is brew coffee and have an NIC, which helps it to connect to the internet. So yeah, and IoT is growing pretty remarkable. It's growing pretty significantly. So there is a research out there that suggests that IoT could be a few $1 trillion industry in the coming years. So this is a great space to venture into right now and make some money. So yeah. This is another slide that gives you an idea of what kind of components or what kind of smart devices we have in each vertical. So we are pretty familiar with the home consumer stuff, right? So smart bulbs, security devices, and even the motion sensor that is here, I'm sure it should be working on Zigbee protocol. So we should have some hub within this auditorium or theater. So these home automation or home consumer devices are something that we find in our day-to-day lives. Moving on to transport and mobility vertical, so we find all these autonomous driving or self-driving cars that are gaining traction, a lot of traction these days, right? So we also, Waymo is trying to build a fleet which is self-driving. So in the near future, we can find ourselves being driven to destinations without a driver or a chauffeur. So that's something that we have to look forward to. And healthcare also has a lot of IoT implementations where the patients don't necessarily have to stay in the hospital to get 24/7 healthcare. So essentially what that means is the patients could have some wearables that keep monitoring their health, that boils down to home consumer devices as well. So as we saw Apple Watch, the latest version of it has an ECG built in. So they're also trying to embed blood pressure monitors into their smartwatch. So healthcare is a huge consumer, I would say, when it comes to IoT space. And yeah, smart buildings, smart cities, smart buildings. Yeah, we see all these temperature sensors, motion sensors within all the buildings that we are huge buildings around these days. So that is something that significantly increases the attack surface. So what is IoT? IoT is nothing but it is a collation of various devices, embedded devices, sensors, and applications basically. So all of these components work in tandem to it's basically like a neatly choreographed dance, right? So all the sensors kind of collect data from the physical world, and this data is sent to cloud infrastructure, which is the backend, which goes ahead and process all this data and does the work for you. The work can be anything ranging from turning on a light to driving your car. So to better understand this, let's take a look at the Samsung's SmartThings architecture. So what we can see here is there are a bunch of devices, right? So devices require a language or a protocol to communicate with each other and the hub. So the protocols that we can see here are Z-Wave and Zigbee. If we have a Z-Wave or a Zigbee device, then the SmartThings hub, or essentially the hub, should be speaking the same language. It should be able to communicate with the devices on the same protocols. And this hub would essentially be located in the same premises. This does not have a huge range or something. So whatever data is being collected from the devices is sent to the hub, which then connects to the internet using a home router. So the architecture that we are looking at is for home automation, right? So it connects to your home router, and then that data is offloaded to the cloud services. So the reason why cloud infrastructure is a huge deal when it comes to IoT is that the embedded devices or the endpoint devices that we have installed in our homes, buildings, whatnot, so they are all essentially, they have a very limited storage. The storage that we are talking about is in kilobytes. So within that storage, it should run a bootloader, it should run a kernel, it should run an operating system, and it should also run an application. So due to this restriction, the devices they usually don't have the compute power required to process all the data or all the information that they collect from the physical world. So all that compute power is given to an IoT solution from the cloud service. So yeah, and we can also understand from this diagram that these devices can also be controlled by Amazon's Alexa and Google Home. The reason why that is possible is that so there is this thing called as third-party integration, right? So Amazon, Google, and Samsung have come together, and they have opened up certain services that each of them can leverage to communicate with each other and control the devices essentially. So you can this is also being implemented by Philips Hue. It's not like a Samsung thing or something. So essentially what this means is you can use your Pixel phone or your Amazon Alexa to control any Samsung bulb that you might have at your home, or even their refrigerators and their washers and dryers. So from a convenience perspective, all these home automation solutions come with a smartphone application and also a web interface. So even that is an attack surface when you look at from an IoT solution as a whole. So let's dive into each of them in the future slides. So yeah, these are the IoT components. So as we talked about, so there will be a device. It can either be an embedded device that is placed in your coffee maker, or it can be an actual sensor like the sensor that we have right here in the corner. And so each device will have an operating system. So the operating system that we are talking about is not an Ubuntu or a Macintosh. So it is something called as a real-time operating system, or commonly known as RTOS. So there are a bunch of real-time operating systems out there, like FreeRTOS, TinyOS, and stuff like that. So the IoT OS that they often lack kind of regulation where so what happens here is that each vendor, they come up with their own operating system, and when we take these operating systems into consideration, they lack all these traditional security measures, that mitigations that we have in our OS, right, like ASLR, DEP, and so on and so forth. So that is something that needs to be addressed. And as discussed, yeah, mobile application and web interface is still a huge attack surface in an IoT solution, because that is basically how all these devices are controlled. And hub is something that collates the data from all the devices, and so hub is essentially a proxy which takes the request from the user and sends them to the devices, and vice versa. It also collects data and sends the information back to the user. So of course, an IoT solution hugely depends on communications. So the communication protocols may range from Zigbee, Z-Wave, Bluetooth to your regular Ethernet cable. And cloud infrastructure is pretty pivotal in an IoT solution. So moving on to the security perspective of an IoT solution, the CIA Triad stays true here, and this is basically the pillars of security even when it comes to an IoT solution. So confidentiality, the state of being secret, is okay. So as we discussed earlier, smart devices are present everywhere, right? So we have security cameras around our homes, and we have all these sensors laying around. For example, if you take Amazon Echo, it has a webcam. It has a camera built in, right? So we may have them in our bedrooms and where not. So that is something. So whatever data or whatever video feed it is getting, it is capturing should remain confidential, and it should only be accessed by the product owners, the device owners, and that is a huge. If this is breached, then there is a huge privacy violation, right? So confidentiality is pivotal. So as integrity. So integrity is the state of being unmodified by unauthorized entities, right? So if we have a security system in our home, so we only want us to be able to unlock the door and not anyone else. So that is something being addressed by the integrity of the solution. Availability is just a state of being available. So if we have all these devices and if they don't respond to our commands, they are no good to us. So moving on to the attack vectors, there are 3 attack vectors similar. Okay, this is not similar. So physical is something that gets added on to IoT solution. So physical attack vector is where an attacker would require physical access to the hardware itself. So this essentially means that the kind of attacks that fall into this category are like getting a root shell on the device itself and offloading data from the devices. Local network is something where the attacker needs to be on the local network or your home network when it comes to home automation to carry out these attacks. So remote is the holy grail of attacks here, where an attacker essentially carries out the exploit from halfway across the globe. So this is a brief list of attack surface that gets opened up when an IoT solution is introduced anywhere. So ranging from your industries to basic home automation. So we can see that device hardware, device firmware, device memory, or rather hardware and firmware are pretty unique to an IoT solution. And device memory, local storage, operating system, they remain the same, right? So we find this even when it comes to our mobile applications, right? So software update mechanism is also a new attack surface that IoT opens up. Network communications, web interface, mobile application, cloud infra, and third-party integration are basically similar to what we do in our regular day-to-day pen tests. So, what is a device? Device, as we discussed earlier, could be an embedded device that is in any dumb device like your refrigerator, washers, and so on and so forth. So, what an embedded device will essentially have is a minimal processor. It will have a small NAND flash storage. We are not talking about megabytes or gigabytes here. It's basically in kilobytes. So that is an embedded device, and sensors can range from anything from motions to temperature sensor. Motion sensors are pretty prevalent in buildings, and proximity sensors as well. And temperature sensor is where you is something where that is mandatory when it comes to your thermostat control, and basically that. And hubs, as we discussed, hubs are required to offload the data to cloud servers, and this is the only mode to communicate with the devices, because they communicate in a custom protocol which none of the mobile devices can at this point of time. So moving on to device security, to carry out a physical attack, you would require physical access, right? So the physical access means that you need to connect to the board via any one of these debug ports. It can be a JTAG, UART, SPI, or I2C. So these debug ports could be found pretty easily, but in a production or in a secure device, you may not find all these pins out. In that case, you will have to manually go ahead and identify those pins and solder on those to the board, and then connect your system to those boards. So if you can see that red ring kind of thing, so that's what a JTAG pin looks like. Often what happens is the JTAG the board mentions it to be a JTAG. There will be a small string written as JTAG. It can be JTAG, JTAG, or whatnot. So JTAG is something that you can use to connect to the board itself. This is how you will be able to get root shells on the devices, and so on and so forth. So lack of TLS, it speaks for itself, right? So any kind of communication, if it is not encrypted, can easily be captured by an attacker, and they can easily eavesdrop on it. And missing security patches, so any kind of device, breaches happen every day. So no one can call their product completely secure. So breaches do happen, and when a researcher comes forward and discloses that vulnerability, it is up to the OEMs to go ahead and patch that vulnerability and send OTA updates. And we can find a lot of small companies that launch products and basically don't offer support. They work more on updating or upgrading their hardware rather than sending updates to their current hardware. So that is a huge gap. There is a huge security gap when it comes to security patches. And so in a case that if you don't have firmware with you, which is the case when it comes to security researchers, so if you have to extract a firmware from the device, you need something called as a bus pirate. That is the red color board that you can see on the top right corner. So you can use that to connect to the board that you would like to offload or extract the firmware from. And so the pink color board is something called as a JTagulator. So JTagulator is something that one can use to connect their laptop to the device that they are testing. So this is how you would be establishing a connection between the PCB and your computer. So to use a JTAGulator, all you need to do is connect the JTAGulator to your laptop via USB, and it comes with a dongle kind of thing which plugs onto the board, and you'll have to connect the other end of it to the JTAG pins of the PCB that you're testing. All you need to do here is give the baud rate. And basically so you'll have to identify the pins like the VCC, ground, RX, TX and stuff like that. So JTAGulator is something, it tends to do all those things for you. If not, you can also use something called as a logic analyzer. Logic analyzers tend to be a little on the pricier side, but yeah, they do a pretty decent job in letting you know what each pin does. So if it is a 5 volt VCC, and it'll also let you know which is the transmission pin and which is the receiving pin. So that makes your life easy. So these two are just an example. I mean, you don't essentially have to use the same device. You could there are a bunch of other devices that a researcher could use to accomplish these tasks. So yeah, you would require a lot of jumper cables to connect these boards to the PCB, and if you are not able to identify the ground and VCC, then you will have to go ahead and grab a voltmeter, and then you'll have to figure it out yourself. And as we discussed, if there are no pins, then you'll have to take out your soldering equipment and solder all the pins onto the board. So yeah, how can the hardware be compromised? So these are, okay, we can see the device, we can see a bunch of vulnerabilities here, like boot root shell, weak serial shell security, default or blank passwords, insecure storage of root passwords and stuff like that. So what happens here is a lot of devices, what they tend to do is already I have to, there's a lot of ground to be covered. Okay, so what essentially happens here is that if you connect via UART or JTAG ports, then if you're doing it for the first time, then a lot of devices let you in directly, and they don't even ask for any password or anything. And certain devices, what they do is they let you go ahead and set the password if you are using it for the if you are connecting via those devices for the first time. Of course, I mean, when we bring a smart device into our home, we don't essentially go ahead and remove the cover and connect it to our laptops, right? So if an attacker walks into your home, they could easily open up the device and connect it and have a shell access. And what they can do from here is they could essentially pop a backdoor on it, and that's a very easy way for any attacker to get back into your home network at any given point of time. So as we discussed, extracting device firmware is something that is very important when it comes to an IoT solution, right? So okay, let's discuss about firmware in the next slides. And always be on the lookout for misconfigured or vulnerable services. Okay, device firmware is essentially okay. We can compare a device firmware to your jar files in an Android application. So firmware is something that contains all the services and whatnot. So if you are able to dump the firmware from a device, and if you're lucky enough to find the firmware not to be encrypted, then yeah, you can basically do whatever you want. And you could look for any kind of hard-coded credentials. You could look for any dormant service which you could activate. And one more interesting thing is that okay, whenever a firmware is being flashed onto a whenever firmware is being flashed onto a device, there should be a signature validation, but oftentimes you will not find that happening all the time. So what you could do is you could modify the firmware. You could create a malicious firmware of your own version, and you could just flash it onto the device. And these are a bunch of tools that you could use to analyze the firmware, best of which is Binwalk. So Binwalk is something that helps you to extract the squash FS and the root FS are basically the file systems from the firmware. So the firmware essentially is a .bin file which you cannot read directly like using cat or vim. So you will have to extract the data from the binary. And of course, you would require a lot of debuggers. And what to do here? Yeah, the first thing that you have to do is check for encryption and extract the firmware and do the drill, right? So go into the file systems, look for any hard-coded credentials. You could also, interestingly, if you come across I should not say that, but if you come across some Chinese hardware, oftentimes you will find some kind of a backdoor or something. I mean, which may not be unintended, but yeah, you may find a lot of those things. And so also look for encryption algorithms. So if you find any hard-coded keys there, then you could basically compromise the communication or the TLS basically. And sensitive information, sensitive URLs as well. You could find admin endpoints or any sensitive endpoints to the APIs that they expose. And you could also look for vulnerable services and so on and so forth. Moving on to device memory and local storage, as we discussed earlier, an embedded device would have limited storage, because of which, due to this, all majority of devices tend to have an SD card. So SD card is something that the devices rely on to obtain the firmware and flash it onto the device. So the firmware directly does not go into the device. It gets downloaded to an SD card and then gets flashed onto the device. So you could kind of perform an MITM attack there and control what kind of firmware goes into the device. And flash storage, as we discussed, so there is a technique where you could leverage the NAND storage. You could just short out a few pins, and you could basically bypass the boot, and that makes the bootloader to fail, and it will give you a root shell on the on the device itself. So volatile and non-volatile memory is something that you will definitely have to look at during runtime and after the device is closed. Oh my god. Okay. So also be on the lookout for sensitive product information and so on and so forth. IoT security is not just hardware security. I think we should be able to understand that by now. So, operating system, as we discussed. So, real-time operating systems is something which is fairly new to the industry, and due to RTOS being fairly new, they do not have a majority of operating system level security mitigations like ASLR, for example, and because because an operating system at like in a 64 KB size, it's very hard to extract kernel from the RTOS itself. So what an RTOS essentially is, it is a fused up version of your bootloader, your kernel, your operating system, and the application itself that drives the device. So syscalls, you can use something called as a syscaller to fuzz the system calls that particular RTOS uses if it is based on a Linux kernel. If not, then you'll have to write your own fuzzer. Trinity is also something similar to syscaller. It is a little easier to use and more versatile. And what to do here is, if it is a Linux kernel, then you could go ahead and try to exploit any known kernel exploits, and also look for misconfigured operating system or services. So this is something that okay, let's go ahead. Software update mechanism, as we so this is something. So software update or a firmware update is something is itself a huge gap here, because the thing is, if you are able to bypass these, if there is no signature validation being done, you could easily flash your malicious firmware, right? And if a signal, okay, let's move ahead. Okay, network communications. These are the various communication protocols that IoT uses at this point of time, which are pretty prevalent. So Wi-Fi, Zigbee, Z-Wave, Bluetooth, NFC, MQTT, and so on and so forth. To play around with the network communications, you would require some custom devices like HackRF1, and the Overtooth one is the device that is shown in the right corner. So HackRF1 is basically used to capture any kind of radio frequency signal. So it can capture anything from your Wi-Fi signal to your GSM. And Overtooth one is used to capture your Bluetooth communications. And from a software standpoint, then you would require a Wireshark to capture the packets. Wireshark is pretty versatile, right? It lets you capture anything from HTTP to MQTT and whatnot. Ethercap is also a really great tool when it comes to packet capturing. And GNU radio is something that you would require to. GNU radio basically pairs with the HackRF to capture the data. So what to look for in a network communication is that always look for unencrypted data, and you will definitely find a lot of traffic that is not encrypted. MQTT these days it is getting encrypted, but if you are able to find an older device that uses MQTT, you would definitely find the data not to be encrypted. And there is an issue with MQTT where MQTT connect command, whenever the MQTT connect command is run, it sends out username and the password along in that request. In that request, so that is something that you should be on the lookout for. And map out the data flow basically just to understand what kind of data is being sent back and forth from the device. And protocol fuzzing is really important. So if you're using a custom protocol, then you should definitely go ahead and perform protocol fuzzing to identify any vulnerabilities within that. So moving on to web and mobile applications, so it is our home turf, right? So web applications and mobile applications have been out there for quite a few years, or rather a decade now. And we basically know what to look for in a web application or mobile application. And web application and mobile application is something. These applications are the entry points to any of your IoT solution, and this is where you get the data. This is how you send your commands as well. So yeah, we know this, and I think we'll just move forward. Default credentials, unencrypted communication, logic, business logic, and okay, cloud infrastructure. This is something that we discussed earlier. So when it comes to huge enterprises, then we really don't have to worry about cloud infrastructure. But still, when in the recent past when there have been breaches to Apple cloud services and things like that. So relatively speaking, smaller companies, they tend to not have all the security mitigations in place, and they even don't have proper audits going on their backend servers. So that is an easier way for an attacker to get into the IoT solution. So it doesn't really impact a home automation system, but this plays a vital role when it comes to an industry in an industrial IoT kind of a situation. Third-party interaction. This is something that this is a new attack surface when it comes to an IoT solution. This is where Samsung, Google, and Amazon tries to work together, work in tandem, share their data, and in a similar fashion, when it comes to huge enterprises, then you don't have to worry about it that much. While compared to a relatively smaller company, when it comes to a smaller company, the odds are that the third party or the data being shared is not particularly restricted, right? So unintentional data leaks are something that you could find very easily. And last but not least, code review is something that is really important when it comes to an IoT solution. A proper rundown of the total source code base is really important here. You require to perform the code review to plug all the security vulnerabilities, because this is the easiest way to identify any security shortcoming. So yeah, security is not a step but a process. So you'll have to keep researching for vulnerabilities and releasing patches for all the identified vulnerabilities, because let's face it, the breach is something that happens every day, and we'll have to there is no other way to get around it but to address it and fix the vulnerability and send out patches. So yeah, thank you for bearing with me. I know I have been really fast, and I couldn't cover most of it, but yeah, I would be happy to take any questions.